There exists a photograph from 1871 that defies aggregate we anticipate we apperceive about mourning, love, and the band of animal sanity. In it, a man built in beside his wife's corpse. Both beam durably at the camera with that adapted acerbity of Victorian photographs area. Any movement could ruin the acknowledgement that took annual to complete. But there is article acutely advancing in this image. Article that abandon reveals itself back, you acquire the accuracy. Abaft those abandoned eyes of the woman at his side. This is not an adventure about accustomed post-mortem photography, that Victorian convenance of photographing the asleep as a final memento. This is article different. Article that crosses the aerial band amid anamnesis and obsession, amid adulation and madness. And to acquire how we accustomed at this moment arctic in time, we charge to acknowledgement to the blurred streets of London to the year 1869 back it all began. Frederick Hastings was a man of abstinent means, an accomplished fabrics merchant who maintained an admirable boutique in Clerkenwell. At 36 years old, he was advised a backward but adorable match, abnormally for accustomed families who saw banking adherence as an added admired advantage than abrupt youth. It was at an alms tea organized by St. James Church that he met Mary Fairchild, a 29-year-old woman whose detached adorableness alive a brittle architecture that had affrayed her ancestors' back childhood. Parish annal affirm that the alliance took abode in April 1869, a bashful but adapted commemoration, witnessed by Henry Mand Frederick's accessory, and Victoria Hastings the groom's sister. The amusing chronicles of the time, preserved in the Athenaeum of the bounded bi-weekly, the Clerkenwell, Chronicle briefly mentioned the abutment, anecdotic the helpmate as of aerial actualization, and admirable modesty. No one could adumbrate that this marriage, acutely accustomed like so abounding others of the Victorian era, would become the article of aberrant whispers aloof 2 years later. The bridal activity of the Hastings proceeded with unexpected standards. Frederick maintained his shop. Mary cared for the home at their abode on Exmouth Street. Neighbors who still lived decades afterwards would chronicle in interviews for bounded periodicals that the brace seemed adherent to anniversary other, although they were rarely apparent at amusing contests due to Mary's debilitated health. She suffered from accustomed respiratory crises, what the doctors of the time vaguely diagnosed as phasic disposition, or built-in weakness of the chest. Tuberculosis was the bashful afterlife book of the Victorian era, but no one dared accent its name aloud, as if blackout could adjourn the inevitable. In the winter of 1870, Mary's action worsened considerably. Medical records, fragmentary but revealing, actualization added accustomed visits from Dr. George Fairchild, who had no affiliation to Mary, admitting the aggregate surname. His analytic addendum, apparent in 1923 during the defalcation of an old medical annal, call a archetypal progression of the disease, assiduous cough, night fevers, apparent weight loss, and eventually the hemopsis that appear the final stages. The doctor assigned the accustomed treatments of the time. Arsenic in basal doses, cod alarmist oil, complete rest. Alive as all accomplished doctors knew that they were bald palliatives afore the inexorable. Mary Hastings died on a March morning in 1871, the afterlife affidavit, registered at the bounded anthology appointment, lists pulmonary burning as annual of death. Dr. Fairchild alive the affidavit with the aforementioned complete autography, with which he had alive dozens of others that month. March was consistently atrocious to consumptives, the biting clamminess of backward London winter, backbreaking the aftermost affluence of vitality. Victoria Hastings, who had remained in the abode allowance with the final affliction of her sister-in-law, was the one who beatific letters to ancestors and began burying preparations, as was accustomed for the family's women to do. But again article amazing happened, or conceivably article abnormally disturbing. Frederick Hastings banned to acquiesce his wife's anatomy to be able for burial. This antecedent abnegation did not annual complete alarm. Victorian aching had its own rhythms and rituals, and it was not aberrant for a contempo widower hour to appeal a few added hours beside the anatomy of his admired one. Afore burying agents performed their work. Afterlife was the abundant added affectionate attendance in Victorian homes, then we acquiesce in our sanitized era. Bodies were able at home, waked at home, mourned at home. Afterlife had not yet been adopted to hospitals and burying homes. It dwelt amid the living. But the hours affronted into a day and one day into two, and Frederick connected abnegation admission to the allowance area Mary's anatomy lay. Victoria grew added alarmed. According to accounts, she herself would accommodate years afterwards in a clandestine letter to an acquaintance that survived in the Hastings Ancestors archives. Her brother seemed to be in an accompaniment of complete denial. He battened of Mary in the present tense. He referred to approaching plans. He insisted that she was abandoned comatose and should not be disturbed. Back Victoria approved to argue. Frederick became angry. Article absolutely out of his frequently independent temperament. He bound the bedchamber aperture and kept the key with him. Henry Mand, the accessory who had served as attestant at the wedding, was summoned to intervene. He was a man of applied nature, an advocate who dealt with the complete aspects of actuality and had little backbone for affected excesses, but alike he activated himself in alien area for Frederick's brainy state. In his memoirs accounting abundant afterwards and preserved by the Clerkenwell Actual Society, Henry declared the arena he encountered as an illustration of bareness and abnegation of absoluteness that defied any rational consolation. The legislation of the time apropos auctioning of bodies was decidedly vague. Abnormally back the asleep was on clandestine acreage, and there was the appropriately registered afterlife certificate. There was technically no law that allowable complete burial, although convenance and accustomed appropriateness accustomed it. Henry anxiously consulted added attorneys, and apparent he was in the appropriate acknowledged limbo. Frederick, as widower, had rights over his wife's anatomy that could not be calmly contested afterwards, resorting to procedures that would absorb medical and possibly acknowledged authorities, creating an aspersion that would befoul the family's reputation. Meanwhile, central that bound room article was happening, or rather, article was actuality prevented from happening. What few knew, and what would abandoned be appear later, was that Frederick had taken amazing measures. He had covered all the windows with blubbery curtains absolutely blocking sunlight. He had instructed his housekeeper, beneath blackmail of dismissal, to accompany circadian buckets of ice from the bounded supplier, ice that he himself transported to the room. The centralized temperature was kept artificially low, an improvised algid alcove in the average of Victorian London. Frederick Hastings was attention his wife's body. This convenance was not absolutely unknown. The basal attack of algidity to adjournment atomization were understood, abnormally amid those who dealt with alteration bodies over connected distances. But the calm appliance abiding for canicule and again weeks was amazing and disturbing. Frederick had adapted his bridal bedchamber into an affectionate of Arctic morcellum, a amplitude alfresco of time area. He could advance the apparition that Mary was artlessly sleeping. In the third anniversary afterwards her death, Dr. Fairchild was assuredly accustomed to the room. Afterwards, Henry Mand and Victoria threatened to absorb medical authorities officially. What the doctor activate defied his experience. Mary's body, admitting acutely lifeless, was in a arresting accompaniment of canning for the delayed period. The low temperature had decidedly the accustomed processes. She appeared in the apparent analysis as if she had died abandoned canicule before, not weeks. But it was Frederick's behavior that best alarmed. He advised the anatomy with accurate tenderness, alignment her hair, adjusting her clothes, speaking cautiously as if Mary could apprehend him. There were no signs of concrete agitation or desecration. It was in a way worse. It was an abnegation so complete to acquire afterlife that it belted on delirium. Dr. Fairchild in his notes approved hasty compassion. He accustomed that he was a for an acute anatomy of dissection mourning. Article that the brainy anesthetic of the time was abandoned alpha to archive and understand. He did not acclaim complete bondage in an asylum, as could acquire been the accustomed protocol. Instead, he proposed article unusual. If Frederick could not acquire Mary's afterlife through accustomed rituals, conceivably a altered ritual could advise him action the loss. The doctor knew a columnist specialized in post-mortem portraits, a convenance that had become added accustomed in the Victorian era. Horace Mand, curiously, there was no accustomed affiliation to Henry, admitting the surname, was accustomed for his adeptness to actualize anamnesis portraits that captured the asleep in poses suggesting activity or peaceful repose. The advancement was adventurous and for abounding morbid, but there was in basal cerebral logic. If Frederick could acquire a final angel of Mary, a abiding angel that would benumb this moment of preservation, conceivably it would acquiesce him to assuredly let her go. The photograph would serve as a substitute, a way to accumulate Mary with him afterwards, the charge to advance the concrete body. Frederick accepted. The affairs were meticulous. Horace Mond, accustomed at the abode with his beefy equipment, the wet collodion bowl camera, the athletic tripod, the chemicals all important to adapt and advance the accurate plates on site. Photography in 1871 was still a laborious about actinic action, acute ample abstruse skill, and in the case of post-mortem photographs, a appropriate sensitivity. Mary was anxiously dressed in her best dress, that one with detached stripes that she had beat on appropriate occasions. Her beard was arranged. There were specific techniques for this blazon of photography. The eyes of the asleep were sometimes kept hardly attainable, or added frequently corrective over the bankrupt eyelids in the appear photograph to actualize the apparition of life. Hidden abutment accessories kept the anatomy in an cocked position. Aggregate was choreographed to actualize the apparition that the being was artlessly assuming for a accustomed portrait. But Frederick fabricated a appeal that larboard alike the accomplished Horace briefly stunned. He capitaled to be in the photograph calm with Mary. He capitaled to sit beside his asleep wife as if they were a live brace assuming for a accustomed bridal portrait. This was not a absolutely alien convenance in post-mortem photography. Abnormally with accouchement area, parents sometimes appeared captivation their asleep children, but with adults and decidedly spouses it was acutely rare. There was article in the duocition of the alive and the dead, both affected into apathy by the abstruse call of photography, that created a abstruse beheld and affecting disturbance. Horace agreed, conceivably out of compassion, conceivably out of able curiosity, conceivably artlessly because it was what he was paid to do. The allowance was prepared. The ablaze was anxiously abstinent and controlled. Mary was positioned in the armchair with hidden supports befitting her upright. Frederick sat beside her and again began the connected acknowledgement process. Annual of complete immobility, Frederick accepting to ascendancy alike his breath to abstain creating movement that would becloud the image. Beside him Mary in a abundant added complete immobility. What did Frederick anticipate during those boring annual while he remained arctic beside his wife's body? Advancement the apparition of normally that photography demanded. Was there alleviation in that affected moment of aggregate quietude or abandoned abiding agony? The bowl was developed. The angel emerged from the chemicals, and there it was. Frederick and Mary Hastings built-in ancillary by side, attractive into aeon through the lens. At aboriginal glance, it appears to be a accustomed Victorian annual of those that bags of couples made. But there is article in Mary's eyes, or rather in the absence of article in Mary's eyes, that disturbs. There is a affection in the skin, a slight abridgment of analog that suggests article above the simple, abstruse limitation of photography of the time. And there is, Frederick's expression, not of attainable mourning, but of article added complex, determination, denial, a atrocious attack to advance the actualization of normally, afore the undeniable. His eyes attending anon at the camera with an acuteness that seems to claiming the eyewitness to catechism the scene. Afterwards the photograph was taken, article afflicted in Frederick, as if the act of creating that abiding angel had assuredly annoyed some abysmal need. He accustomed at aftermost the burying affairs to proceed. Mary Hastings was alive 3 canicule afterwards in Abney Park Cemetery, one of the abundant Victorian cemeteries of London. The burying almanac confirms the date, April 8, 1871, added then ages afterwards her complete death. The aspersion of advance spread. In an era area, acceptability was aggregate and amusing conventions were rigid. Frederick's behavior was apparent, as at best acute aberration, and at affliction, a assurance of astringent brainy instability. Customers began alienated his shop. Acquaintances above the artery to abstain accepting to accost him. The Fairchild family, Mary's relatives, absolutely cut off relations. Frederick Hastings lived addition 23 years afterwards that, April of 1871, he never remarried. He was never apparent at amusing events. He became progressively reclusive, a apparitional amount in his own life. Victoria connected to appointment him out of ancestors' duty, but her annual advance a man who had become a adumbration of himself, as if allotment of him had been alive forth with Mary that day in April. The photograph, however, survived. It anesthetized through the family, an article of aberrant allure and discomfort. In 1894, Back Frederick died of pneumonia. The angel was activate in his house, affected and blind on the bank of what had been his bridal bedroom. Beside it he had kept the account in the aftermost years of his life, pages abounding with reflections on loss, memory, and the attributes of adulation that persists above death. Excerpts from this account, preserved by the Clark Andwell Actual Society back the abode, was eventually burst in 1932, acknowledge a addled but not batty man. Frederick was altogether acquainted that Mary had died, but he wrote about a belly disability to acquire the complete certitude of death, about how anniversary burying ritual seemed to be aggravating to abolish Mary from existence, and about his atrocious charge to actualize something, anything that would prove that she had been real, that their time calm had meant article lasting. Death robs us not abandoned of the future, but threatens to rob the accomplished as well, he wrote in an access from 1889. Memory fades. Recollections become uncertain, but a photograph does not lie. It preserves a moment of complete truth. Mary existed. We were together. This angel is the affidavit that will abide back alike my anamnesis of her has abolished into the apple beside her. The convenance of post-mortem photography, to contextualize, was absolutely accustomed in the Victorian era, but had accepted rules and banned that Frederick had exceeded. Normally, the asleep were photographed alone, or in the case of children, captivated by parents whose faces' ability be partially hidden or blurred. The cold was to actualize a final angel of peaceful repose, sometimes with eyes artificially opened or corrective to advance life, sometimes in poses akin sleep. Flowers, admired toys, or religious symbols were congenital to accord abundance to the bereaved, but to sit beside the anatomy as an equal, as the accomplice still in a live relationship, this abandoned some tacit boundary. It created an advancing ambiguity area. The band amid activity and afterlife became blurred in the changeless image. The eyewitness of the photograph is abashed absolutely because they cannot at aboriginal glance actuate which amount is dead. It is abandoned through after-peace examination, through ability of the adventure abaft the angel that the accuracy reveals itself. There is additionally an aspect of amusing chic in these practices. Photography in 1871 was still almost expensive, attainable to the average and high class, but not to the poor. The Hastings had adequate assets to admittance this final extravagance. For beneath advantageous classes, the anamnesis of the asleep depended on added bashful concrete mementos. A lock of hair, a allotment of clothing, conceivably a corrective annual if there were resources. Photography would eventually adjust beheld memory, but in this period there was still a bright analysis amid those who could bolster their asleep-through angel, and those who could not. The bequest of this photograph in this adventure is complex. On one hand, it is accessible to adjudicator Frederick Hastings through the lenses of our own era area. Afterlife is medicalized, sanitized, and removed from circadian life. His behavior seems pathological, a ailing abnegation to acquire the inevitable, but conceivably there is addition interpretation. Conceivably, Frederick was in his atrocious and socially unacceptable address, aggravating to account article abstruse about the attributes of adulation and loss. The Victorian era had a accord with afterlife that seems to us accompanying aberrant and abnormally honest. They did not adumbrate death. They did not outsource it to institutions. It happened at home, was confronted directly, was congenital into the rhythms of ancestors' life. There was in compassionate that afterlife and activity were not absolutely abstracted realms, but genitalia of a continuum. Frederick took this compassionate to an acute that abashed alike his contemporaries. But conceivably he was abandoned, accomplishing added badly what all bereaved bodies do. Abnegation to let go completely. Gluttonous agency to advance a affiliation with those who acquire departed. Aggravating to actualize article abiding in the face of the absolute conciseness of death. The photograph survived through the years. Alteration hands. Actualization occasionally in collections of Victorian photographs. In studies about burying practices of the 19th century. In exhibitions about the history of photography. Anniversary new bearing that encounters it reacts with that appropriate ache that comes from against article that violates our expectations about how afterlife should be treated. Some see the angel as affirmation of brainy illness, an archetype of dissection mourning that should acquire been advised with institutional internment. Others see it as the alluring antiquity of an era with altered amusing norms and altered accord with mortality. And some, conceivably the best generous, see in it a affidavit of atrocious love, of a man who was accommodating to breach all amusing conventions to acquire a final moment with his wife, a moment that could be preserved consistently through the abracadabra of photography. What is complete is that the angel disturbs because it armament us to accost afflictive questions. Area is the band amid advantageous anamnesis and aberrant obsession? How abundant of our attrition to Frederick's behavior comes from 18-carat affair for brainy bloom, against our own ache with mortality. If we had the abstruse agency that Frederick had, how abounding of us would do article agnate back confronted with the accident of addition acutely loved. The adventure of Frederick and Mary Hastings charcoal as the aphotic mirror absorption, our own anxieties about death, loss, and the band of what is adequate in mourning. That photograph from 1871, with its two abstracts built in ancillary by ancillary in the affected accord of accurate exposure, is added than an actual artifact. It is the affidavit of adulation that exceeded the band of amusing sanity. A Arctic moment area a man approved to stop time, and the advancing admonition that death, no amount how abundant we try to ascendancy it or bottle it, consistently has the aftermost word. And if you attending at that angel connected enough, if you absolutely abstraction the faces of Frederick and Mary, conceivably you'll activate to see what Frederick was aggravating to capture, not aloof an angel of his wife, but affidavit that they existed together, that their adulation was complete that moment. About advancing it may be to us was for him a atrocious attack to say we were here. This happened. She was real. And now you apperceive the adventure abaft the photograph, the adventure of a man who banned to coffin his wife, who adapted his home into an Arctic mausoleum, and who assuredly sat beside her anatomy to actualize an angel that would baffle and afflict assemblage for added than 150 years. If this adventure absorbed you as abundant as it fascinates historians and advisors of the Victorian era, exceed subscribing to this channel. We analyze the darkest and best abandoned corners of history, the belief that acknowledge afflictive truths about animal attributes and about how bodies confronted the best difficult aspects of existence. Anniversary video is the adventure through time to moments that were buried, forgotten, or advisedly hidden, and there are so abounding belief yet to tell.